The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands and millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind is the Tathagata. Today is the fourth day of this 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate, and it would be a good idea to give you something of as near a map as possible of Zen practice, because there are no real instructions. It's moment to moment suggestions and guidance as things come up for people, but there is a general pattern of what can happen. And I'd like to go through that now, because some of you have been experiencing this, both those of you here at Mountain Gate and those of you who are on Zoom as well for this sesshin. So there's something in our life that inspires us to get in touch with some form of Zen practice or some form of meditation. And it is not anything we can put in words ordinarily, but it is something that draws us to the practice. In my own case, it was the fact that TM, Transcendental Meditation, was very popular back in the 1970s. And I always had an interest in trying to find something beyond words. There was a sense that there was something that I could open to if I had the right tools to reach it. And so I was interested in doing TM, and actually came very close to going ahead with it. I happened to be living in Turkey at the time, and came back to the United States for a visit and do a little bit of work. And the friend I was staying with was going gangbusters into getting a transcendental meditation practice going. And I saw the prerequisites, and somehow it didn't reach me. I wanted to do meditation. I was sort of interested in doing TM. It seemed quite simple and quite short. And so rather than doing that, I found the telephone number of a Tibetan Buddhist group that was having regular sittings. And I actually called them and found out when they were going to be sitting, but I didn't go ahead and do that. Went back to Turkey. And somehow, in one of the times that I was back in the States, because I was living in Turkey, in Istanbul, and I would come back to the States for a couple of months every year and go back into my old work, which was design work. There was one particular client I could go get in touch with, and he always had work for me, and I could get well paid and go back and work in Turkey, where I also worked. I worked for a while with the Earthquake Institute that was connected to Boğaziçi University as, believe it or not, a bilingual secretary, Turkey, typing on a Turkish keyboard, which was kind of interesting and fun. I also worked very briefly for 3M, that is Minnesota Manufacturing, whatever the other M is, until one Saturday morning, my boss came to my apartment, knocked on the door at 7:30 in the morning and said, "Don't go to work on Monday. We are leaving Turkey." The person who had been running the office before I took over has just been called in by the police, and his passport has been confiscated. Don't go to work. So that was the end of my brief work as a bilingual secretary, which was kind of funny, for 3M in Istanbul. So I also would come to the States, as I said, and pick up some very high-paying work for my previous work in the United States. And on one of these times, I had picked up a book in a bookstore, and something jiggled in me. I bought the book, went back to where I was staying. Back then in the DC area, there were, and probably still are, lots of residential hotels, because there's so many people who go in for shorter periods of time, months or so, that need a place to stay on their way to someplace else because of official business and so on. So it was easy to find a place to stay. At any rate, the upshot of it was something happened, and I had encountered probably the only person in Turkey who did meditation. And that person did both TM and Zen meditation, which I wouldn't suggest doubling up. But at any rate, his connection was with the Rochester Zen Center. And so I called the Rochester Zen Center to ask if I could speak with Roshi Kapleau, because I didn't understand what had happened to me. And they said, well, you have to come up and do a workshop. And then after the workshop, you can talk to him if you want to. So I did that, went back to Turkey, and that began my work at the Rochester Zen Center. When we sit down for the first time to do Zazen, it's kind of a new and interesting adventure. Zen practice has a exciting hype in the West, or at least in America, and so it's kind of cool to be a Zen student. And we learn how to sit in the different meditation positions and go for it. And initially, it is, as I said, kind of interesting and exciting. We're learning how to do this practice. We are assigned a practice, not yet a koan ordinarily, and a practice that helps to ground us to the point where it's appropriate if one desires to have a koan to work on, to do so. But that initial practice that we teach here at Mountain Gate, the extended out breath, is a practice that can go a long, long, long way, even bringing forth awakening experiences for people who practice it sincerely and with dedication and on a regular schedule. So that happens. Initially, we're in a kind of a honeymoon period. And then if we really are practicing seriously, there comes a point when the shit begins to hit the fan. Because Zen practice will uncover where we are caught and bring it to our own attention. And when I say where we are caught in ideas about ourselves, in feelings about past experiences. If we've been traumatized, it can bring up flashbacks and memories, at which point you should seek the services of a trauma therapist. Zen is very, very powerful medicine, but in those particular cases, it's important to get additional support from a trauma therapist. The two can go hand in hand beautifully, actually, and one can make much faster progress in both Zen practice and therapy if you're doing both at the same time. I have many, many therapist friends who have said so, and it's also been my own experience as well. So when the shit hits the fan, we begin to see things about ourselves that we have sort of stuffed under the rug, put away in a drawer and locked it, stuck in the closet. We don't want to see it. We don't want to recognize it because it's not comfortable. We don't want to think that we do things like that or say things like that or whatever. And a certain amount of this is a result of our assumptions of how we have been treated as children and also growing up. It's very telling that the Uvalde shooter who came into a grade school and massacred students and teachers, that he had been bullied a great deal of his life. And it sounds like he'd had a very unpleasant, non-supportive childhood as well, from what little we can glean from the newspapers. It's a terrible set of situations that brings a person to the point where they have no other recourse to avoid the pain than to create an enormous pain in somebody else. But what can happen at that point when we begin to see things more clearly, we begin to see our own behavior, our own mind states more clearly, is a couple different things. One is that it's very uncomfortable. Another is that we begin to think that what's really happening is, rather than the Zen practice being supportive and bringing us to awakening, it's actually making us worse people. It's not true. It's only showing us more clearly how we behave. This is not something that needs to be judged, although we do judge it, because most of us have spent a good part of our life being judged. At the very least, we get grades in school, and sometimes in the interest of raising children who are ideal and reflect a parent's abilities, our parents, misguided, treat us in ways that probably no child should be treated. And sometimes through their own difficult situations, they do not nurture children in ways that children should be nurtured and supported. And all of that comes up for us if we do serious Zazen. At that point, people are tempted to flee, and many people do, actually. It was very interesting at a time when there were approximately 30 people in residence at the Rochester Zen Center. It was Roshi Keplo's heyday. I'd been there for several years at that point, and there would be 300 and some people coming to Sunday morning sittings. And they were, sitting 3 deep in the Buddha hall. They were sitting downstairs in the hallways, in the basement. They were sitting in the dining room. They were sitting upstairs in the Sanzen waiting room, Doksan waiting room. They were sitting in the Zendo. Every possible place they were sitting for these Sunday morning sittings. And it was kind of amazing. For months without gap, this many people were coming. And then I began to realize that actually, yes, we were having 300 some people come every Sunday morning to sit and hear teisho, but there were actually only about 30 some outside of our 30 some that were living at the Rochester Zen Center that actually were constant. There was a changing sea of faces, and a very, very small percentage, perhaps 10% of people that stuck it out and stayed coming again and again and again. And then there were people who did stick it out, and after a few years would vanish. Many of those actually would come back after 5, 10, 15 years, this time with a renewed commitment to practice. When I was head of Zendo one sesshin, there was a young man who came to sit the sesshin. It was his first sesshin, and the next morning he'd vanished. That was the end of that. And the rule at the Rochester Zen Center, and pretty much any Zen temple, most places, I don't know of exceptions really, except, well, No, I won't say anything further than that. And that if somebody leaves without permission in a sesshin, then they are not allowed to come back to a sesshin ever again. That was the rule in Rochester. So 4 years later, and I was still head of Zendo, he applied for sesshin again. And I had a sense that maybe he could manage it this time. And so I didn't remind Bowden that he had left. And so he was accepted. And the second morning, I found him crumpled in a heap outside my door. And he was in the same anguish that had caused him to leave the first time. He told me that he had his wife drive him to the center. He had left his keys, he had left his wallet, he had left everything at home so that he could hopefully not flee this time. And he was in anguish. He had bumped into whatever it was, and I never found out what it was. But we talked for a while, and he decided to face his dragons and stuck it out to the end of sesshin and was so ecstatic. He had actually managed to do it. And not only did he do it, but he did tremendous positive work in the process. Then there was another person. This is a great big guy from Texas who would come always to 4 days of any sesshin. He would never come to the full sesshin. And I asked him one day, why don't you come to the whole sesshin? He said, well, because when on the 4th day, the fear begins to come up. And so I said, well, why don't you give it a try? So the next sesshin, he did sign up for the whole 7 days. And on the actually beginning the 4th day, he was literally shaking on his cushion. But he stuck it out. And at the end, he too was ecstatic. He had, again, faced whatever it was, and one never knows what these things are, but we all have our dragons, and had succeeded in working through whatever it was. And from then on, he came to 7-day sesshin. There is a anywhere between a bump and a mountain that can come up for us in practice. And often it will come up the 3rd or the 4th day. The first day of a sesshin is one of relative ease. We're sort of getting our sea legs back, because even if we've been to a number of sesshin, we still, we're not used to sitting as many long hours a day. And so we begin to adjust to that. The second day is, okay, now we're adjusted to the physical challenge. Now comes the mental emotional challenge. And it can be a kind of a roller coaster ride. And by the end of the 3rd day, usually that roller coaster ride has sort of begun to flatten out a bit, and we're able to get to deeper work. Doesn't always happen that way, but if you stick it out and if you just keep working to apply your mind to feel the sensations in your body that are uncomfortable or even blank, because feeling a feeling where there's no feeling is also important, because that means you've shut something down. And it's important to allow yourself to open to it in order to become free of it. So then we progress. And what can happen when we have faced a dragon and bested it, or when we can reach to a significantly deeper part of our practice, what can happen first is the absolute clarity and freedom that comes in that experience, and then comes the ego backlash. So if you're aware that this can come, that this can happen, it will make all the difference in the world, because you'll do your zazen, you'll be committed to deepening. It'll deepen and deepen. You'll struggle perhaps with whatever, and manage to get over that hump and into a deeper place. And at a certain point, the excitement and the freedom that has come as a result of that, and this is not yet Kensho, by the way, will sort of reverse. And it will seem that you've gone backwards and that you can't practice at all. That's what I call the ego backlash. Ride it out, and it will change. And you will find yourself going deeper yet. Practice is not really easy to anticipate. We have times when it's easy to practice, times when it's difficult to practice. There's no telling when it's going to be which. All I can say is every single sesshin is different from the last. And there's no point in making plans for, I'm going to do it this way. Every sesshin beginning talk, Roshi Kapleau used to say, this time is going to be when you're going to come to awakening. This is going to be your time for Kensho. And I would say, yes, this is going to be my time to have a Kensho. And of course, it wouldn't happen. It wasn't until I gave up the whole idea that things began to go deep enough that could unfold. So that's something else to recognize. If we keep going with one eye on the prize, so to speak, trying to grab the gold ring as we go round and round, we're seriously diluting our practice. And I say diluting and diluting both. And it's important just to give up that stuff. Recognize you don't know, that you won't know, that you can't know, because it's underground. It's not intellectual work. It's not like going to a chemistry class and memorizing the table of elements and doing your experiments and so on and so forth, and coming out at the end of the semester with a nice grade. This is a very, very different kind of work. It does not use your intellect. It uses a different part, a deeper part of your being that knows without having to speak in words. And that is normally there when we were very young, but is so often trained out of us. School, at the very least, will do that, because in school we get grades not based on what we feel, but what we think. And so we are taught to think our way through life. And that is like being a hovercraft, where you're not in touch with the water, for example. The ferry to Vancouver from Seattle is one of those, and you can hear it go by. It's quite noisy twice a day, and it just flies above the water. There are other similes, but it's important to sink into the practice if you're going to make progress, and not, although you're going to be tempted all the time to do so, not try to analyze it, not try to estimate whether you're doing bad or good or any of the rest of it. And speaking of bad or good, one of the things that can come up, that comes up for many people, particularly if they've had upbringings in which their parents were challenged, They can have a negative self-image, which will raise its ugly head during Zazen, because we get more and more sensitive to everything as a part of the process of Zazen. And so if there's any sense that we're not worthy, it'll come up and hit us in the face. Don't believe it. The Buddha, when he had his great awakening, said, "Wonder of wonders, all beings are endowed with this profound mind of perfection, compassion, awakening, clarity, wisdom. But because the minds of men and women are turned upside down through delusive thinking, they fail to perceive it." And Zazen is about opening more and more, letting go the external covering that we have used to feel protected and safe and as if we exist, and dare to simply explore within. Two, as that Korean master said so many centuries ago, turn the light inward and trace the radiance down to its source. When I was in grade school, every so often, I don't remember whether it was daily or whether it was only on Fridays or something, the teacher would read us out loud a book. And one of them, and unfortunately we moved before the tale could be finished, was sort of a mystery book. And in it, this young man was exploring down a shaft in the earth that apparently had been something to do with mining. And he's on a rope being lowered. And the idea is he's to jerk 3 times to be raised. Well, he suddenly realized that there is something has come out of a side entrance, whatever you want to call it, a side tunnel, that has been working to cut the rope. So if he tries to do his 3 jerks on the rope, he's going to probably drop into the abyss. And that we can reach a place like that in our Zen practice. When that happens, what we want to do is tune into the terror that might arise. This is the edge of the cliff, metaphorically. In that statement, let go your hold on the edge of the cliff and leap hands held high into the fiery abyss. That's what it can feel like. But if you dare, if you walk smack into the fear and feel every ounce of that terror in the fibers of your body, it's amazing what can happen. I used to have dreams of falling, and they used to wake me up at night. I would always be about to fall on the edge of something, and I would catch myself and wake myself up. And when I was doing Zen practice, where you don't get a lot of sleep if you're living at a Zen center, not in those days anyway, I was kind of annoyed when this dream started popping up again. And so I thought, okay, it's only a dream. I'm going to let it continue. And so I let it continue the next time it came up, but I copped out in a different way. I fainted in the dream, so I didn't know what happened. So then, thoroughly disgusted by this now, the next time it happened, I let myself open to the full experience of the dream. I felt myself falling. I could see these gigantic black rocks at the base of this tall cliff on the edge of the sea. And somewhere down, halfway down, I realized without a doubt, at a profound level, that whether I fell to my death at the bottom or survived. There was no difference. There is no death except in appearance. It was phenomenal. It was immensely freeing, and I never had the dream again. And then many, many years later, I had another falling kind of dream where I was walking around the top of a mesa. And I know that those mesas are over across the river on the way to Los Alamos. And I see myself slipping, feel myself slipping. I'm a probably 13-year-old Native American kid. And I look around wildly for something to grab onto to stop my slide. And there's nothing but a little bit of grass, which won't help hold me. So then I think, okay, it's just a dream. I'll see what happens. And I went hurtling down at a particular angle, and then the angle changed to even more steep. And I fell all the way to the bottom, probably 50 feet, 100 feet, probably 50 feet, and landed on my feet to my utter amazement. And the ride, because I surrendered to it, was exhilarating. The initial fear had transformed into excitement, exhilaration. This is what can happen when we don't try to prevent something from going forward, when we allow ourselves to open to the sensations in our body that can come up when things pop back at us during sesshin. There is a period of time when you can have dreams that will conceivably, they indicate that things are going forward, but not in a way that you would necessarily recognize that until afterwards. Dreams that indicate you're feeling out of control. And if you have grown up in a way where you need to have control just to feel safe, these dreams will pop up. If they do, when they do, just feel what it feels like. The two that I've related to you before that I had recurring dreams were that I was driving into a parking lot and suddenly the brakes didn't work and the car kept going. And I would struggle. I would try to put it in reverse, and then I'd shoot backward and reverse. Still, I couldn't brake. And that was some version of that was a recurring koan for a particular time in my practice. And it's when I was beginning to let go. And you have to let go in order to come to awakening. You have to let down your shield. You have to dare to emerge into the world naked, in a sense. Speaking of that, that was the other dream in which I was in the middle of a grand ballroom that had probably 500 people in it at some kind of meeting, and they were all standing around chatting to each other. They weren't dancing. And I'm in the middle of it, and I suddenly realize I have not a stitch of clothing on me, and everybody else, of course, does. And I glance to see where the exit might be, and I would have to go dashing through all these people, and it would be highly noticeable if I was doing that naked. So that would always end the dream, that this sinking feeling that there I was naked. And I'm sure that it was a reflection of my Zen practice at the time, that I was feeling like I was being seen through, and I'm sure I was, by Roshi Keplo. And it was a very, very uncomfortable experience, given how I had grown up. So these kinds of things come up in our practice. But if we, instead of trying to barricade ourselves from them, if we open our arms and surrender to the sensations in our body that accompany them, that's where the freedom lies. to go into the sensations, not to try to stop the feeling. That is of no use whatsoever and can never succeed anyway. If anything, it'll just push whatever the problem was back underground. And in order to be free, you want to allow it to process. And the only way I know, in my experience of many, many years of practice, is to feel it. And I share again the background of the book Focusing by Eugene Gendlin, who actually turns out to have been a philosopher, but most of his work in his life was done in the realm of psychology. He worked with Carl Rogers, who was a famous psychologist of an era back in the 50s, I think it was. Anyway, they did a study, or he did a study, in which they were trying to figure out what it was that allowed certain people in therapy to progress very rapidly and other people to stay stuck. What was the difference? What was going on in the therapeutic session, or within the person who is the therapist, or within the person who is the therapy? And very quickly they discovered that the ones that were able to move forward with ease, even though it was challenging, were the ones who were introspective. In other words, they turned inward, not with thought, but they felt what was going on in their body. And of course, that has no name necessarily. You can't necessarily identify it other than it's a discomfort. It's an uncomfortable feeling. But when people were able to focus in on those feelings that came up, they made progress quite rapidly. And so he wrote a book called Focusing and spoke of what he called the felt sense. In other words, what does the energy in your body at a given moment feel like? When you allow yourself to surrender to it, to tune in and just kind of explore it, and it cannot be a wordly exploration. It has to be one beyond words, where you're simply tuning in and getting a sense of the feeling. It can be quite liberating. And this is also something that is extremely important in Zen practice. Zen practice really at base is about uncovering the innate perfection that we always have been, but that has been cloaked in ideas, in experiences that have given us assumptions about ourselves and caused us to try to compensate by behaving in certain ways or doing things in certain ways to try to feel safe and secure and cared about. But that's just covering. And it usually is a covering that's not particularly comfortable. And so if we dare to let go, needing to have that security blanket, and it takes time, and it's important for you to allow it to take time and not to push it too much, it will gradually free you. It's not instantaneous by any means. Although Roshi Kapleau, when he went to Japan, had the intention of grabbing Kensho and leaving, he stayed for 11 years. And then he came back and continued to work on himself and to teach, to share that insight into in working with other people to help other people reach that point as well. So know that this roadmap really doesn't have a lot of signs. And it's kind of written in the air. So it doesn't even have a firm piece of paper to go by or firm instructions, because it is beyond words. So there's no way words can give you instructions beyond basic minimal instructions that I just gave you. The work then is to take those instructions and really, really dive in, because when you do, it will be amazing. To become even a little bit free is phenomenal, and you can become much more than that. To be able to be present in every single moment brings this life into a richness and fulfillment that wouldn't be there otherwise. Yet, we try to distance ourselves from life because of fear, because we've had experiences in some cases, in many cases, where being fully present wasn't a fun experience. Dare to do it. And for the rest of us, it happens to be just habit pattern of the world these days almost demands of us that we not pay attention. We get so many dings. I just got 2 on my phone a second ago, to pay attention to something else quick. And then your mind is jerked over to something else, and then something else, and then something else, and then something else. And if you're trying to do something, it's going to be very difficult to accomplish that because you keep being pulled away. So learn how to focus, learn how to dare to focus, learn how to dare to be present, because it is rich and fulfilling, and it's how you're meant to live. So on that note, I thank you for listening, and we'll recite the 4 vows. And my goodness, I went over time. Sorry about that, but hopefully it will have given you valuable information.